My son vanished without a trace exactly 5 years ago. I spent every last dime of my life savings, sold my entire construction company, and gave up the home I built with my own two hands just to find him. I was left with absolutely nothing, living in a rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a call from the police to tell me they had found his remains. But the knock on my door did not come from a detective. It came from my brother, a man I had not spoken to in 20 long years. And what he told me that stormy afternoon was the beginning of a nightmare far worse than my son simply being dead. If you are just starting to watch this story now, I need you to brace yourself, because the betrayal I uncovered will make you question the very people sitting at your own dinner table. It was a miserable Tuesday in late October. The Montana rain was hammering against the tin roof of my one-room cabin. I am Thomas, 71 years old, and on that day I was sitting at a splintered wooden table eating cold chicken noodle soup straight from the tin can. The power had been cut off 2 days prior because I could not afford the $40 bill. I sat there in the freezing gloom, listening to the steady drip of a leak over my narrow cot. My bones ached. My spirit was completely broken. 5 years of chasing ghosts will do that to a man. 5 years of waking up every single morning wondering if today was the day I would finally find out what happened to my boy Henry. Then the sound of an engine cut through the noise of the storm. It was not the familiar rattle of the local mail delivery truck. It was a deep, powerful purr that vibrated through the muddy ground. I looked out the smeared glass of my only window and saw a vehicle that did not belong anywhere near this part of the forgotten woods. A sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom was idling right in my muddy front yard. The heavy driver's side door opened, and a large black umbrella was thrust out into the rain. A man stepped out, wearing a bespoke tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire cabin was worth. He did not rush to get out of the downpour. He walked with the arrogant, measured pace of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. I would have recognized that confident walk anywhere. It was Richard, my younger brother. We had not exchanged a single word in 2 decades. 20 years ago, we had a massive falling out over our family estate, a bitter feud that ended with him walking away to build his real estate empire and me staying behind to build my contracting business from the ground up. I opened the rickety wooden door before he could even knock. We just stood there for a long moment, the icy wind howling between us. He looked older, his hair completely silver now, but his eyes were as sharp and unyielding as they had always been. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply looked at my hollow face, looked at the rusted tin can in my trembling hand, and said 7 words that stopped my heart from beating. "Get in the car, Thomas. I know where Henry is." I dropped the soup can. It clattered against the wooden floorboards, spilling what little food I had left, but I did not care. I grabbed my worn-out canvas coat and followed him out into the pouring rain. The interior of the Rolls-Royce smelled of rich leather and expensive cologne. It was suffocatingly warm. As his driver pulled us away from my miserable existence, the silence between Richard and me was thicker than the storm outside. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter in the center console, but he offered me nothing. He just stared out the rain-streaked window. I had 1,000 questions screaming in my mind. Is he alive? Is he hurt? Where have you been hiding this information? But my throat was completely sealed shut with terror. For 4 agonizing hours we drove south. The steady rhythm of the windshield wipers was the only sound in that luxurious cabin. And in that heavy silence I was forced to sit alone with my demons. I thought about the terrible day Henry disappeared. He had taken my boat out on the lake for a weekend fishing trip and never came back. The rescue teams found the boat washed ashore, completely abandoned. There was no blood. There was no note. Just empty air. I refused to believe he had drowned in those cold waters. I hired the best private investigators in the state. When the money ran low, I sold my heavy machinery. Then I sold the company name. Then I sold my house, the very house where I raised him, and where his mother had passed away. I poured millions of dollars into dead leads and greedy informants. I bankrupted myself for the absolute love of my son, reducing my entire life to a rotting shack in the woods. And now my estranged billionaire brother had shown up out of thin air, claiming to hold the missing puzzle piece. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone walk out of your life without a single trace? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of not knowing the truth? If you have ever fought tooth and nail for someone you love, please hit the like button right now. It helps me know that I am not alone in this pain. And tell me in the comments what state you are watching from today. I love seeing where all of you are listening from and what time it is there right now. We crossed the state line into Idaho just as the sun began to set, casting a dark, bloody red glow over the horizon. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. My hands were shaking so violently I had to pin them under my thighs to hide my weakness. I was bracing myself to arrive at a local police station. I was preparing my exhausted soul for a county morgue, getting ready to identify a skeleton or a piece of torn clothing. But the luxury car did not exit toward the city center. Instead, we merged onto a winding private coastal highway that hugged the edge of a massive, pristine lake. We approached a set of towering wrought iron security gates. The driver punched in a secure code, and the heavy metal gates swung open silently. We drove up a long, winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured trees and expensive landscape lighting. Finally, the Rolls-Royce came to a smooth stop. I looked out the tinted window, completely bewildered. We were not at a hospital. We were not at a police precinct. We were parked in front of a sprawling $10 million modern lakefront mansion. The architecture was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls glowing warmly in the twilight. I turned to Richard, my voice trembling for the first time in hours. I asked him why we were here. Richard finally turned his head and looked at me, his expression completely unreadable and cold. "Because, Thomas," he replied softly, "this is where your dead son lives." I stumbled out of the Rolls-Royce before the engine even fully shut off. The heavy rain of Montana had been replaced by a crisp, clear Idaho evening, but I could not feel the breeze. My entire body was numb. I pushed past my brother Richard, ignoring the security guard standing by the towering front doors. I did not care if I was trespassing. I did not care if I was going to be arrested. My brother had just told me that my dead son was living inside this $10 million fortress, and my mind simply could not process the cruelty of that statement. I stumbled along the side of the massive stone driveway, following the glow of landscape lights that led toward the back of the estate. As I rounded the corner of the house, the scent of burning charcoal and seasoned meat hit the air. It was such a normal, everyday smell, completely out of place with the storm of panic raging inside my chest. I stepped onto a sprawling terrace paved with imported marble. Beyond it lay a massive infinity pool that seemed to drop right off into the dark, rippling waters of the lake below. Soft jazz music was playing from hidden outdoor speakers, and there, standing by a massive stainless steel outdoor grill, with his back turned to me, was a man. He was laughing at something on his phone. He casually flipped a thick, ribeye steak with a pair of silver tongs. He was wearing a crisp white linen shirt, expensive tailored shorts, and leather loafers. When he raised his left hand to adjust the grill's temperature, the patio lights caught the brilliant gleam of a heavy gold watch on his wrist. It was a Patek Philippe. I knew the brand because I had once admired one in a magazine, knowing I could never afford it in 10 lifetimes. But it was not the watch that made the breath completely leave my lungs. It was the shape of his shoulders, the way he stood, the thick, dark hair that I had washed in the sink when he was a toddler. I tried to speak, but only a dry, broken gasp escaped my throat. The sound was just loud enough to cut through the quiet jazz music. The man froze. He slowly lowered the tongs. He turned around. It was Henry. My son. The boy I had spent 5 years and every last penny of my fortune trying to find. He was not dead. He was not a skeleton at the bottom of a lake. He was not being tortured in some dark basement. He was 38 years old, deeply tanned, radiating perfect health, and living like a king while I was starving in a leaky shack. For a second, the universe just stopped making sense. The patio spun around me. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold marble floor. I could not breathe. I clutched my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Henry dropped the silver tongs. They hit the stone with a loud clatter. His face drained of all color, turning completely pale in the soft outdoor lighting. "Dad." He whispered the word like he was seeing a ghost. He ran across the patio and dropped to his knees right in front of me. He grabbed my shoulders, his hands warm and strong. I reached out, my trembling fingers touching his face, his hair feeling the solid living reality of him. A profound, agonizing wail tore out of my throat. It was the sound of 5 years of pure, distilled agony finally releasing itself. I pulled him against my chest, sobbing uncontrollably, burying my face in his expensive linen shirt. I did not care about the mansion. I did not care about the watch. My boy was alive. But as the initial shock began to settle, the reality of the situation crashed down on me. I pushed him back just enough to look into his panicked eyes. Why, I choked out, my voice ragged and broken. "Why did you leave me? Why did you let me think you were dead?" Henry began to cry. Real heavy tears streamed down his perfectly tanned face. He gripped my hands tightly, shaking his head with a look of absolute desperation. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have to understand, I had no choice. I did it to save you. I did it to save Rachel." He looked around frantically, as if someone might be watching us from the dark lake. He pulled me closer and began to spin a story that sounded like it came straight out of a nightmare. 5 years ago, while working as a senior portfolio manager at his investment firm, he claimed he had stumbled onto something terrifying. He told me he found a hidden ledger. His firm was not just managing wealthy tech money. They were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars for a ruthless cartel south of the border. I found out too much. Dad Henry whispered, his eyes wide with fear. They knew that I knew. They cornered me in the parking garage one night. They put a gun to my head and showed me pictures. Pictures of you at the construction site. Pictures of Rachel sleeping in our bed. They told me if I went to the police, they would slaughter both of you and make me watch. My blood ran cold. I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. The only way to keep you alive was to disappear. He continued, his voice trembling. I had to make them think I was gone. So I took the boat out. I staged the accident. I gave up my entire life, my name, my wife, my father, just to make sure those monsters would not come after you. I have been in hiding ever since, living in a gilded cage provided by a private security contact who helped me vanish. I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry for the pain I caused you, but I kept you alive. It was a flawless, heartbreaking explanation. It hit every single emotional trigger a father could have. I wept even harder, pulling him back into my arms, asking him to forgive me for ever doubting him. I told him how much I loved him, how I had sold everything to find him, how none of the money mattered as long as he was breathing. Henry helped me up from the cold marble floor. He wrapped his arm around my frail shoulders and guided me toward the towering glass doors of the mansion. The inside was even more opulent, with towering ceilings and modern art hanging on the walls. It felt like stepping onto another planet. I need to call her, I said, reaching into my pocket for my cheap, cracked cell phone. I need to call Rachel. She has been mourning you for 5 years, Henry. She works double shifts at a diner just to feed your son. We have to tell her the nightmare is over. Henry stopped dead in his tracks. His grip on my shoulder tightened until it actually hurt. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path, his face suddenly deadly serious. No, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. You cannot tell Rachel. You cannot tell anyone." I looked at him in confusion. "But Henry, if the cartel thinks you are dead—" He grabbed both of my arms, digging his fingers into my flesh. "Listen to me, Dad. The cartel still watches her. If she suddenly stops mourning, if she changes her routine, they will know. They will figure out I am alive and they will kill her and my son. You have to swear to me right now on your own life. You will not breathe a word of this to Rachel. She is in terrible danger if she knows." I stared into his eyes, searching for the boy I had raised. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. He looked terrified, desperate, like a man balancing on the edge of a razor blade. He shook me gently. "Swear it to me, Dad. Promise me you will let her keep believing I am dead. It is the only way to protect her and my boy. Promise me." My mind was spinning. The sheer exhaustion of the last 5 years, combined with the emotional whiplash of finding him alive, made it impossible to think clearly. I looked around the silent, massive room, feeling completely out of place in my muddy boots and soaked clothes. I thought of my daughter-in-law Rachel weeping in my arms at the memorial service. I thought of my young grandson growing up without a father. The idea of keeping this secret from them felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. But then I looked back at Henry. My flesh and blood. He had sacrificed his entire existence, staged his own death, and lived in hiding just to keep us safe from ruthless killers. How could I question him now? How could I risk the lives of my family? Because I could not keep my mouth shut. "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I swear I will not tell her." Henry let out a long, shaky breath. He pulled me into another hug, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Thank you, Dad," he murmured softly. "Thank you." I stood there, in the middle of that $10 million living room, holding my miraculously resurrected son. I should have been the happiest man on the face of the earth. But as I hugged him back, my eyes drifted over his shoulder, looking out through the glass doors toward the patio. My gaze landed on the heavy solid gold Patek Philippe watch strapped to his wrist, gleaming under the indoor lights. A small, cold knot of unease began to form in the very pit of my stomach, tight and undeniable. If he was a terrified man living in hiding, running for his life from a bloodthirsty cartel, why was he wearing a $50,000 watch? The rest of the evening passed in a strange, surreal blur. Richard barely spoke another word, retreating to a separate wing of the massive estate, leaving me alone with the son I had mourned for 5 agonizing years. Henry had guided me to a guest bedroom that was larger than my entire cabin back in Montana. The sheets were made of spun silk, the mattress felt like a cloud, and the temperature was perfectly climate-controlled. But as I lay there in the dark, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, sleep absolutely refused to come. I was exhausted down to my very marrow, yet my mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I did not see the face of a terrified man hiding from a ruthless cartel. I saw the glint of that heavy gold watch under the patio lights. A man running for his life. A man who had sacrificed everything to protect his family does not reward himself with a $50,000 luxury timepiece. It was a detail that simply did not fit the tragic narrative he had spun for me. The knot of unease in my stomach twisted tighter with every passing minute. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe in that perfectly silent, sterile room. My throat was bone dry. I needed a glass of water, and I needed to walk around to burn off the anxious energy coursing through my veins. I pushed the heavy silk duvet off my legs and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The mansion was completely still. The only sound was the faint lapping of the lake water against the stone retaining wall outside. I walked softly in my bare feet, navigating the dimly lit corridors, trying to remember the way back to the massive kitchen we had passed earlier. The moonlight spilled through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the imported hardwood floors. It was a beautiful home, but in the dead of night it felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. As I made my way down the wide corridor, I passed a set of heavy mahogany double doors. One of them was pushed slightly ajar. I stopped. Through the narrow gap I could see the sleek interior of a lavish home office. There was a massive desk carved from dark wood surrounded by walls lined with custom-built bookshelves. I told myself to keep walking, to just go get my water and return to bed. But the nagging intuition of a father, the gut feeling that something was terribly wrong, anchored my feet to the floor. I gently pushed the heavy wooden door open a few more inches and slipped inside. I do not know what I was looking for. Perhaps some piece of evidence that would prove his cartel story was true. I took a step deeper into the dark room, my eyes adjusting to the shadows. But in my distraction, my foot caught the edge of a thick Persian rug. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing, and my knee slammed hard into a heavy metal trash bin beside the desk. The bin tipped over with a loud metallic crash that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. I froze instantly, my heart leaping into my throat. I held my breath, listening for the sound of footsteps upstairs, praying I had not woken Henry or Richard. The mansion remained perfectly quiet. Letting out a slow, shaky exhale, I dropped to my hands and knees to clean up the mess before anyone could notice. A pile of discarded papers, crumpled envelopes, and glossy magazines had spilled out onto the rug. I began gathering them up in the dim moonlight. My hands were shaking. As I picked up a crumpled ball of thick paper, my thumb brushed against something printed on the top. I flattened it out on my knee, squinting in the low light. It was a banking document, specifically a wire transfer receipt from an offshore account. The numbers printed on the page made my vision blur. $25,000. I read the amount again, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks. But it was not a one-time transaction. The document clearly stated that this was an automated recurring weekly transfer. $100,000 a month was being funneled out of this account. My mind raced back to the cartel story. Was he paying them off? Was this extortion money to keep us safe? I traced my calloused finger down the page to the recipient section, desperate for answers. The name printed there was not a shadowy shell corporation. It was not an anonymous numbered account. It was a name I recognized instantly. A name that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. The recipient was listed as Rachel Higgins. Higgins was my daughter-in-law's maiden name. Rachel, who was supposedly grieving in Seattle, working double shifts at a diner just to feed my grandson. She was definitely not a victim. She was not a struggling widow left behind in his disappearance. She was receiving $25,000 a week from the dead husband she was supposedly mourning. The cartel story was a complete fabrication. They had played me. They had let me sell my home, my business, and my entire life while they quietly hoarded a fortune. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me so hard I felt physically sick. I gripped the receipt, my knuckles turning white. Just as I tried to process the monstrous reality of what my own son had done, a sudden bright glow illuminated the dark mahogany desk above me. I slowly stood up. Henry's expensive tablet had just lit up with a calendar notification. I leaned over the glowing screen, reading the stark black letters displayed across the glass. It was a travel alert. Flight to Zurich confirmed for next Friday. I did not wait for the sun to rise. I did not pack my small bag or leave a note for my brother or the stranger who used to be my son. I simply turned around, walked out of that lavish home office, and slipped through the heavy doors into the freezing night. My chest was tight with a rage so profound it felt like I had swallowed broken glass. I walked down the highway until I reached a diner where a trucker agreed to take me to the bus station. By the time morning broke, I was on a bus heading straight for Seattle. I needed to look Rachel in the eye. I needed to see the woman who had cried on my shoulder at the memorial service. The woman who claimed she was working herself to the bone to raise my grandson. The drive was a slow torture. Every passing mile was another reminder of the 5 years I had lost the business I had sacrificed, and the tears I had shed for a ghost. I watched the heavy rain streak against the dirty glass window, feeling a dark, cold clarity settling firmly over my tired mind. When I finally arrived at Rachel's suburban Seattle home, it was late afternoon. I stood on the porch, staring at the front door, feeling the heavy thud of my heartbeat. I raised my fist and knocked twice. A few moments later, the deadbolt clicked and the door swung open. Rachel stood right there, wrapped tightly in a faded, oversized gray cardigan, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. When she saw me, her eyes widened in carefully practiced surprise. She immediately brought a hand to her mouth, letting out a soft, dramatic gasp. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling perfectly. She pulled me into a tight embrace, resting her head against my chest. I forced my arms to wrap around her, forcing my muscles to relax, so she would not feel the absolute disgust radiating from my body. She ushered me inside, guiding me to the kitchen table with the gentle touch one might use on a stray dog. She immediately went to the stove to boil water for tea, sighing heavily as she leaned against the counter. "Oh, Thomas, it is so good to see you," she murmured, wiping an imaginary tear from her cheek. "I am just so exhausted lately. I picked up another double shift at the diner this week. The manager is breathing down my neck, but what choice do I have? The grocery bills keep going up, and my little boy needs winter clothes. It is just so hard doing this all alone without Henry." She looked over her shoulder, giving me a sad, brave smile that made my stomach churn. I sat there in the silence of her kitchen, nodding slowly, playing the role of the sympathetic, clueless father-in-law. I murmured my condolences. I told her how proud Henry would be of her strength. Every word tasted like poison on my tongue. But while Rachel was performing her monologue of misery, my eyes were scanning the room. I spent 40 years as a general contractor. I know the cost of materials. I know when a house has been quietly upgraded. Right above the main front door, partially obscured by a fake decorative floral wreath, was a sleek black camera. It was connected to a biometric smart home security system. I had installed the exact same luxury model before my company went completely under. That system alone cost $15,000 to purchase and thousands more to wire correctly. A diner waitress working double shifts to buy winter clothes does not drop 15 grand on biometric security. I looked down at the hallway runner rug. Kicked casually into the corner was a pair of pristine black leather high heels. They had distinctive red soles and gold clasps. Jimmy Choo, a brand new pair that cost more than my monthly food budget back in Montana. Then I noticed her heavy winter coat draped over the back of the dining chair right next to me. As I leaned closer, pretending to inspect a picture frame on the wall, a distinct scent drifted up from the fabric. It was not the smell of cheap diner grease. It was the sharp, musky scent of sandalwood and bergamot. It was a bespoke, incredibly expensive men's cologne. It was the exact same cologne Henry had been wearing last night when he hugged me on that marble patio in Idaho. The sickening reality of their arrangement locked into place. She was not a grieving widow. She was a frequent visitor to that mansion. They were laughing at me together while collecting $100,000 a month. My rough hands began to uncontrollably shake with pure anger, but I quickly and carefully folded them quietly right in my lap. Rachel poured the steaming water into 2 ceramic mugs and carried them over to the table. She set one down in front of me with a weary sigh. "I am going to go upstairs and wake the boy from his nap," she said softly. "He will be so thrilled his grandpa is here. Just drink your tea and rest, Thomas. You look so tired." She turned and walked up the carpeted stairs, leaving her cell phone resting face up on the polished granite kitchen island. I sat perfectly still, listening to the soft thud of her footsteps retreating to the second floor. The house fell silent. Then a sudden vibration rattled against the granite. The screen of her phone lit up, glowing brightly in the dim kitchen. I stood up slowly, stepping quietly across the linoleum floor. I looked down at the glowing screen. A new text message had just arrived from an unknown, unsaved number. The preview bubble displayed 6 simple words that made the blood in my veins run completely and utterly cold. Did the old man buy it? I stood in the dim kitchen, my eyes locked on the glowing letters of that text message. The words burned into my retinas. The faint sound of Rachel's footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs, accompanied by the sleepy murmurs of my grandson. Panic and pure rage warred inside my chest, but I knew I could not confront her now. If I let her know I had seen that message, they would run. I forced myself to step away from the island. I walked back to the dining chair and sat down carefully, arranging my face into the mask of a tired old man. When Rachel walked into the kitchen carrying my grandson, I greeted them with a weak smile. I hugged the boy, breathing in the scent of his hair, and my heart shattered again. They were using this innocent child as a prop. I stayed for exactly 20 more minutes. It was the hardest performance of my entire life. I sipped the bitter tea, nodded sympathetically, as Rachel complained about her fictional financial struggles and told her what a wonderful mother she was. Finally, I feigned a coughing fit, placing a hand over my chest, and told her I was simply too exhausted to stay longer. I promised to return later in the week. Rachel walked me to the front door, offering just one last theatrical embrace. I walked down the concrete driveway, feeling her eyes on my back, until the heavy door clicked shut. I marched down the sidewalk until her house was out of sight. The moment I was safely alone, the facade violently crumbled. I ducked into an empty alleyway and collapsed against the cold brick wall. My legs simply gave out. I pressed my hands against my face, gasping for air as a fresh wave of agony washed over me. I had spent 5 years grieving a boy who did not exist. I had sold my construction empire and starved myself in a freezing cabin, while my son and his wife were laughing at my misery. I slammed my fist into the brick wall, the sharp pain grounding me, reminding me this was real. The tears stopped flowing, replaced by a cold resolve. They thought I was just a clueless old man. They were terribly wrong. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cracked cell phone. My hands were finally steady. I scrolled through my sparse contacts and pressed the call button for the man I never thought I would ask for help again. The line rang twice before he answered. He did not say hello. He just waited. "Richard," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "You were right about everything." I swallowed the last remnants of my pride, the bitter resentment that had kept us apart for 20 years. "I need your help. I need your resources. My son is playing me and I am going to tear his world apart." Richard did not gloat. He asked where I was. When I told him I was in Seattle, he gave me the address of a luxury hotel downtown. 2 hours later, I was sitting in an opulent hotel lounge. A man in a sharp gray suit approached my table and slid into the leather booth. He did not offer his hand. "My name is Lawson," he said, his voice flat. "Your brother sent me. I am a corporate investigator, and Richard pays me to find the things people desperately want to keep buried." Lawson opened a sleek silver laptop and turned the screen toward me. He treated my tragedy like a crime scene, which was exactly what I needed. "Where do you want to start, Thomas?" I looked at the blank screen, my jaw tight. "Start with the money," I told him. "Start with the day my life fell apart." Lawson began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard. For hours we sat in that dimly lit booth, drinking black coffee, while he dismantled the financial history of my ruined life. I explained how my contracting business suddenly collapsed in a mountain of debt right around the time Henry disappeared. I had always assumed the business failed because I was paralyzed by grief. But Lawson shook his head, pulling up archived banking records from the Federal Registry. What he found made the air leave my lungs. "Look closely at this document," Thomas Lawson said, pointing at a scanned digital file. It was a commercial equity line of credit taken out against my company's heavy equipment and commercial real estate. The total amount was $8 million. The date of the transaction was exactly 3 days before Henry supposedly went missing. I leaned closer to the screen. There was a signature on the dotted line. It was my name, but I had never seen this paper in my life. The loop on the capital T was completely wrong, slanted too far to the left. It was the exact way Henry used to forge my signature on his report cards. He did not just run away, I whispered, the crushing weight of the truth settling over me. Lawson nodded grimly. No, Thomas. He liquidated your company, secured the cash in an offshore account, and faked his death so he would not have to pay it back. He left you holding the bag for $8 million. That is why you went bankrupt. That is why you lost your home. He stole your life to fund his own. I sat back in the leather booth. The cartel story was a pathetic joke. My son had systematically destroyed me out of pure greed, and Rachel was in on it the entire time. A dark calmness settled into my bones. If they wanted to play a game of destruction, I was going to show them how a master builder dismantles a house. I stared at the glowing screen of Lawson's laptop, watching the cursor blink next to the forged signature. That single jagged loop of ink represented 40 years of my life. I closed my eyes, and the memories hit me like a physical blow. I remembered starting my construction company in 1980, with nothing but a rusted-out Chevrolet pickup truck and a box of hand tools. I remembered working through broken ribs, working through the blistering heat of July and the bone-chilling freezes of December just to make payroll. I built that company from a single-man operation into a regional empire, pouring every ounce of my sweat and blood into its foundation. I did it all so Henry would never have to swing a hammer. I paid for his Ivy League education, his expensive suits, his luxury apartment, so he could work in a clean, air-conditioned office. And from that very office, using the education I paid for, he had systematically engineered my absolute destruction. Lawson tapped the keyboard, pulling up a secondary set of documents. He did not act with pity. He operated with the cold, surgical precision of a man who dealt in ruined lives every single day. He is a predator, Thomas Lawson said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet hotel lounge. He did not just forge a document and hope for the best. He orchestrated a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. Lawson explained how Henry had used his senior position at the investment firm to bypass the standard banking verifications. He had drafted completely fabricated board meeting minutes, claiming my company was restructuring. He used his insider knowledge of my corporate accounts. I had trusted him to help manage to approve the massive commercial equity line of credit. $8 million drained from the equity of my heavy machinery, my warehouses, and the very home I raised him in. I sat there gripping my cold cup of coffee, feeling the residual humiliation of my bankruptcy wash over me. I remembered the day the bank officers arrived with the local sheriff to padlock my equipment yard. I remembered the sheer terror and confusion sitting across from federal auditors who looked at me like I was a mastermind criminal hiding money. I had begged them to understand that I knew nothing about the loans. I had wept in the courtroom, humiliated in front of my employees and peers, believing my grief over my missing son had somehow caused me to neglect my own business. I had blamed myself. For 5 excruciating years, I carried the guilt of losing the family legacy, while the true architect of my ruin was living in a $10 million mansion on a pristine lake wearing a $50,000 watch. Richard slid into the booth next to Lawson. My estranged brother had been standing by the hotel bar, giving me space to process the initial shock. But now he joined the War Council. He placed a glass of water in front of me. I looked at him, my billionaire brother, who had warned me decades ago that I spoiled my son too much. The pride that had kept me from speaking to Richard for 20 years dissolved completely, leaving only a dark, hardened resolve. I am sorry, Richard. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laced with pure steel. You were right about him. I was a blind, foolish old man, but I am not blind anymore. I need your resources. I need your money to tear his world down. I will pay you back every single cent if it takes my last breath. Richard did not gloat. He did not throw the past in my face. He simply looked at me with those sharp, unforgiving eyes, the same eyes our father used to have. You do not owe me an apology, Thomas, Richard said quietly. We had our differences, but you are my brother. Nobody does this to our family and gets away with it. You built your empire once. Now we are going to use my empire to bury him." He turned his attention to Lawson, his demeanor instantly shifting from a supportive brother to a ruthless chief executive. "Strip him bare, Lawson. I want to know where every single penny of that $8 million went. I want his accounts, his aliases, and his escape plans." Lawson gave a sharp nod, his fingers flying across the keyboard with renewed intensity. It took him less than 20 minutes to break through the next layer of Henry's deception. He traced the routing numbers from the forged loan documents. The money had not stayed in the United States for more than 48 hours. Henry had funneled the entire $8 million into a series of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, and from there it was dispersed into private offshore accounts. The timeline was perfectly, brutally calculated. The final wire transfer, draining the last drop of my life savings, cleared on a Thursday morning. That Friday afternoon was the exact day Henry took my boat out onto the lake and disappeared. "He staged the accident the moment the cash was secured," I said, saying the words out loud to force myself to accept the monstrous reality. "He crashed the boat, left it for the police to find, and walked away a millionaire while I was left holding a mountain of debt." Lawson leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Yes," he agreed. "But an operation like this requires constant maintenance. The $25,000 weekly wire transfers you found in the mansion prove that he is slowly bleeding those offshore accounts dry and funneling the money to Rachel. They are cleaning the stolen money through her legitimate bank accounts in small, consistent batches to avoid triggering federal red flags." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Have you ever realized that the person you loved most in the world was actually a stranger wearing a mask? If you have ever felt the chilling realization that you have been entirely manipulated by someone you trusted with your life, let me know in the comments below. It is a pain I would not wish on my worst enemy. Lawson suddenly stopped speaking. His eyes narrowed at the glowing screen. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He hit a few more keys, rapidly opening legal databases and public court registries for the state of Washington. Thomas Lawson said, his voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "We have a massive problem. I thought they were just slowly draining the accounts to live comfortably, but I was wrong. They are not planning to stay hidden much longer. Look at this court docket. Something terrible is going to happen next week." Lawson did not immediately explain what the court docket meant. Instead, he raised a hand, his eyes scanning the endless lines of code and financial routing numbers cascading down his screen. "We need to look at the offshore accounts first to understand why they are moving now," he muttered, his fingers flying across the keys with a frantic energy. He isolated the routing number from the crumpled wire transfer receipt I had found in the Idaho mansion. The $25,000 weekly payments to Rachel were just the tip of the iceberg. Lawson initiated a deep dive protocol utilizing proprietary software that bypassed the standard banking firewalls of the Cayman Islands shell companies. I sat there in the heavy silence of the hotel lounge, watching the dark screen illuminate with the undeniable proof of my son's monstrous greed. The primary holding account materialized on the screen. It was registered to a holding corporation out of Panama, but the ultimate beneficiary was listed under an alias Lawson easily traced back to Henry. The transaction history painted a sickening picture of a man living like an absolute emperor while his father starved. Lawson pulled up the property deed for the $10 million lakefront mansion in Idaho. It was purchased in cash, entirely funded by the money Henry had stolen from my life's work. There were receipts for luxury sports cars, private yacht charters in the Mediterranean, and high-end jewelry purchases, including the $50,000 Patek Philippe watch I had seen gleaming on his wrist. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, with a physical pain that threatened to suffocate me. I thought about the winter I spent without heat, wrapping myself in 3 layers of thrift store blankets, just to keep from freezing to death. I remembered standing in a pawn shop, handing over my late wife's wedding ring to a stranger behind bulletproof glass, begging for enough cash to pay a private investigator for one more week of searching. I had stripped myself of every single comfort, every ounce of dignity, and every precious memory I owned, all because I believed my son was in danger. Meanwhile, Henry was sipping expensive champagne on a marble patio, laughing at the pathetic old man who was footing the bill for his private paradise. But Lawson was not finished. He dug deeper into the timeline of the disappearance itself. If Henry was going to orchestrate a fake death, he had to leave a trail of expenses. Lawson explained, pulling up credit card statements from the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Sure enough, the trail was glaringly obvious once we knew where to look. There was no cartel money laundering ring. There were no ruthless killers threatening our family. It was a completely fabricated ghost story designed to manipulate my paternal instincts. Lawson found the transaction for the boat Henry had crashed. He bought it using my credit line. Lawson also uncovered a wire transfer to a shady maritime salvage crew paid to deliberately damage the hull and leave it drifting in the lake. He found the receipt for a private charter flight, booked under a fake passport, departing a rural airstrip just hours after the boat was abandoned. Henry had flown to a luxury resort in Mexico to wait out the initial media frenzy before quietly relocating to Idaho. The sheer calculation of it all was terrifying. He had not panicked. He had not made a mistake. He had executed a perfectly orchestrated financial hit against his own father. My son was a predator, a cold and calculating sociopath who viewed my love as nothing more than a tool to be exploited. I looked at Richard, who was sitting across from me with a jaw set in stone. He poured me another glass of water, his silent presence giving me the strength to keep breathing. Have you ever been stabbed in the back by your own blood? Let me know in the comments, because what we found next will make your blood boil. The betrayal of a stranger is something you can eventually get over, but betrayal by a child never truly heals. It alters the fundamental way you view the entire world. If you understand this kind of pain, please leave a comment so we can support each other. Lawson cleared his throat, bringing my attention to the laptop. He minimized the offshore banking records and pulled up the Washington State Family Court Registry he had briefly mentioned earlier. The offshore accounts are running dangerously low, Thomas Lawson explained, pointing to the dwindling balance on the screen. Maintaining a massive estate, buying luxury cars, and sending $100,000 a month to Rachel burned through the stolen $8 million faster than anticipated. They are almost out of cash. That is why they are making their final move. He maximized the legal database window. The screen displayed a formal legal petition filed by Rachel Higgins in the King County Superior Court. Lawson highlighted the scheduled hearing date. It was set for exactly 7 days from now, next Friday morning. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, struggling to make sense of the dense paragraphs. I asked Lawson what exactly Rachel was trying to accomplish. Why would she involve the court system if they were trying to stay under the radar? Lawson did not look away from the screen as he answered. His voice was a flat, ominous whisper that chilled me to the bone. He clicked on the specific case file, waiting for the secure document to load. The progress bar crawled across the screen, building a suffocating tension in the small hotel booth. When the document finally materialized, Lawson noticed the title of the legal filing, scheduled for exactly 7 days from now. This petition is the final nail in your coffin, Thomas. Lawson murmured softly, his eyes scanning the horrifying text. The bold black letters on the screen revealed the absolute final phase of their master plan. The horrifying document was titled, Petition for Declaration of Presumptive Death. I just stared at those words, the cold legal terminology feeling like a heavy physical weight pressing against my chest. Lawson leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of emotion, delivering the facts with brutal efficiency. In Washington, Lawson explained, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the monitor. A missing person cannot be declared legally dead until a specific time has passed without a single trace of their existence. That waiting period is exactly 5 years. Next Friday marks exactly 5 years to the day since local police found your boat drifting empty on the lake. Rachel has filed paperwork to have the state officially pronounce your son deceased. She scheduled the final hearing before a county judge to secure the death certificate. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. Why go through all this trouble to make it official now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. If Henry was successfully hiding in a $10 million mansion, why risk bringing a judge and the legal system into their lies? Why not just continue draining the offshore accounts and live in shadows? Lawson let out a heavy sigh, closing the court docket and bringing up new encrypted financial documents. Because Thomas, the offshore accounts are not enough to sustain them anymore. Henry burns through cash faster than he can steal it, and they have one final payday waiting right here in the United States. He tapped the keyboard, and a scanned copy of an insurance contract filled the screen. It was a comprehensive corporate life insurance policy. The principal sum insured was $5 million. I stared at the name listed under the primary beneficiary. Rachel Higgins. Lawson turned to look directly in my eyes. When Henry orchestrated his disappearance, he did not just steal your $8 million. He left you legally responsible for the corporate loans that destroyed your contracting business. Under federal bankruptcy laws and the specific clauses of this commercial loan, if the primary debtor and the guarantor are officially declared dead, corporate debt can be entirely discharged by the estate. Rachel is not just going to the courthouse to collect $5 million in clean, untraceable money. She is going there to legally wipe away the remaining $8 million debt still haunting your ruined company. Once the judge signs that paper, the insurance company will write her a check, and the banks will completely write off the forged loans. They will be free and clear, completely absolved of the financial crater they left behind. I sat frozen in the booth, the magnitude of their greed washing over me in cold, suffocating waves. My son had not just stolen my past and ruined my present. He had calculated exactly how to extract every last drop of blood from my future. He used my endless grief as a convenient shield to run down the clock. For 5 years, I cried myself to sleep, praying for a miracle while they were simply waiting for the legal calendar to hit the 5-year mark so they could cash in on my suffering. Richard slammed his fist against the table, rattling the coffee cups. The sheer audacity of it is staggering, my brother muttered, his eyes narrowing. They think they have played the perfect game. They think nobody is watching. Lawson nodded, pulling up the final piece of the puzzle. He maximized the notification I had seen on Henry's tablet, back in the Idaho mansion. It was a confirmed first-class travel itinerary, booked under a fresh set of alias passports. They are not planning to stay in the United States once the judge signs that death certificate, Lawson stated, tracing the flight path on the screen. The moment the $5 million clears into Rachel's accounts, she is scheduled to board a direct flight from Seattle to Zurich. Henry is flying out of a private airfield in Idaho to meet her there. Switzerland has incredibly strict banking privacy laws and no reciprocal extradition treaty for financial crimes of this specific nature. Once they land in Zurich and funnel the insurance payout into a numbered Swiss account, they will vanish completely. They will be entirely untouchable. You will be left bankrupt in a freezing cabin in Montana, and they will spend the rest of their lives drinking champagne in the Alps, funded by the absolute destruction of your entire existence. The silence in the hotel lounge grew incredibly heavy. The faint sound of jazz playing from the hotel speakers felt entirely detached from the horrific reality unfolding at our table. I looked down at my hands. They were heavily scarred, calloused from decades of swinging hammers, pouring concrete, and building homes to provide for a boy who had turned into a monster. For 5 years, my hands had trembled with sorrow. Every time I looked at a photograph of Henry, every time I saw a father walking with his son on the street, my hands would shake with uncontrollable grief. But as I sat there staring at the Zurich flight itinerary, a profound physical change happened to my body. The trembling completely stopped. The tears that had burned the back of my eyes for half a decade simply evaporated. The suffocating pain that had lived in my chest was suddenly replaced by a cold, absolute vacuum. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I did not feel pity for the boy I had raised. I felt a terrifying, perfect calmness wash over my entire soul. It was the absolute clarity of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I slowly looked at my brother and the investigator sitting across from me. I did not cry. I did not shake. I leaned forward, my voice completely devoid of any hesitation or fear. "I am not going to just stop them," I said, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "I am going to destroy them." Lawson and Richard moved with frightening speed. Once we knew the date of the court hearing, we had exactly 7 days to plant me inside her house. I could not simply knock on her door and ask to move in. She was paranoid, guarding her secrets like a dragon hoarding stolen gold. We needed a Trojan horse. We needed a scenario so completely undeniable and pathetic that she would be forced to open her doors to me. Richard used his vast network to orchestrate the perfect tragedy. He contacted a discreet, highly compensated private cardiologist who owed him a massive favor. Then we set the trap. It was Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before she planned to stand before a judge and declare my son legally dead. I waited until Rachel was picking up my grandson from his expensive private preschool, a school actually funded by my stolen millions. I stood on the sidewalk down the street from the school gates, waiting for her sleek silver SUV to pull up to the curb. The moment I saw her step out of the vehicle, smiling that fake smile at the other mothers, I put the plan into motion. I stumbled forward onto the concrete pavement. I clutched my chest with both hands, gasping for air. I let my knees buckle, collapsing against a wrought iron bench before sliding down to the cold sidewalk. It was not entirely acting. The physical toll of the last 5 years made it easy to look like a man at the end of his rope. A pedestrian screamed. Within seconds, a crowd gathered. Rachel, hearing the commotion, turned her head. I saw the moment recognition flashed across her face, followed immediately by a look of sheer annoyance. But with a dozen parents watching, she had no choice. She ran over, kneeling beside me, playing the role of the frantic daughter-in-law. She screamed to call an ambulance. Conveniently, Lawson had a private medical transport waiting just 2 blocks away. The paramedics rushed to the scene, loaded me onto a stretcher, and whisked me away to a high-end private clinic Richard had secured. Rachel followed the ambulance in her SUV, forced into playing the devoted family member. An hour later, I was lying in a pristine hospital bed, hooked up to terrifying beeping monitors. My skin was pale, my breathing shallow. The door opened, and Dr. Harrison walked in, followed closely by a weeping Rachel. Dr. Harrison was a brilliant actor, wearing his white coat with authority. He looked at Rachel with deep, manufactured sympathy. He explained that I had suffered a massive angina attack, compounded by severe heart failure. He told her my heart muscle was completely giving out. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Higgins," the doctor said softly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But there is nothing more surgical intervention can do. His heart is simply too weak. He has a few weeks left, perhaps a month at most. It is time to make him comfortable." I watched Rachel through half-closed eyes. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly for the doctor to hear. But I could see the rigid posture of her shoulders. She was not crying. She was relieved. She was mentally calculating how my convenient death would solve her final loose ends. When the doctor left us alone in the sterile room, Rachel sat in the chair next to my bed, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. "What are we going to do?" I slowly turned my head to look at her, channeling every ounce of genuine pain I had ever felt into my expression. I reached out with a trembling hand and grasped her wrist. "Rachel." I gasped, my voice a weak, rattling wheeze. "Please. I do not want to die in a cold hospital room. I do not want to die alone." Please let me spend my last few days near my grandson. Let me sleep in your guest room. I will not be a burden. I just want to hear the boy laugh one more time before I go to see Henry." Rachel froze. I could practically see the gears turning in her calculating mind. She desperately wanted to dump me in a hospice facility and wash her hands of me. But she also had a court hearing in 3 days. She was going to stand before a superior court judge and ask for a massive financial payout based on her tragic sympathetic situation. What would the judge think if he found out she abandoned her dying father-in-law in his final hours? Taking me in would make her look like an absolute saint. It was the ultimate bulletproof alibi for her character. She squeezed my hand, offering me a gentle, angelic smile. "Oh, Thomas, of course," she murmured sweetly. "You are family. You will come home with me. I will take care of you. You can spend all the time you want with your grandson. We will make your final days beautiful." I closed my eyes, letting a single genuine tear slip down my cheek. "Thank you, Rachel," I whispered. "You are an angel." 3 hours later, a private medical transport van pulled into her driveway. They wheeled me through her expensive front doors and settled me into the luxurious first-floor guest bedroom. Rachel fluffed my pillows, brought me a glass of iced water, and quietly shut the heavy mahogany door behind her, leaving me alone in the dim room. The moment the latch clicked into place, the facade completely vanished. I sat up in the bed. My breathing leveled out. The trembling in my hands vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical steadiness. I was no longer a dying, pathetic old man. I was inside the walls of her fortress. The Trojan horse had breached the gates, and the destruction of her perfect stolen life was about to begin. I waited in the dark until the digital clock on the bedside table flashed 2 in the morning. The house was completely silent, wrapped in the heavy dark stillness that only comes in the deepest part of the night. My chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. I threw off the luxurious duvet and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I did not need a cane. My heart was not failing. The weakness I had displayed hours earlier evaporated, replaced by the precise, calculated focus of a man on a mission. I slipped out of the guest room, my bare feet making absolutely no sound on the imported hardwood floors. My first obstacle was the biometric smart home security system Rachel had installed to keep the world out. It was a sophisticated piece of technology, complete with motion sensors and infrared cameras covering the main living areas. A normal intruder would have triggered an alarm the moment they stepped into the hallway. But Rachel had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the general contractor who had built this house. I poured the foundation. I framed the walls. I personally ran the electrical wiring through the bones of this building before the drywall ever went up. I knew exactly where the main junction boxes were hidden. I quietly stepped into the utility closet, opened the secondary service panel, and bypassed the low-voltage relay that powered the interior motion sensors. I did it blindly, relying purely on muscle memory. The red indicator light above the hallway camera blinked off. I was officially invisible. I moved silently into the main living room, navigating the shadows until I reached the closed doors of Rachel's home office. I turned the handle, slowly wincing at the faint click, and pushed the door open. The room smelled of her expensive perfume and new paper. I pulled a small black velvet pouch from my pajama pocket. Lawson had given me 3 micro-audio transmitters. They were military-grade, smaller than a dime, and capable of picking up a whisper from 20 feet away. I knelt beneath her oak desk, running my hands along the underside until I found a hollow gap. I peeled the adhesive backing off the first transmitter and pressed it firmly into the wood. The tiny device vanished into the shadows. Next, I crept back out into the hallway, where Rachel had carelessly tossed her luxury handbag onto a decorative console table. It was the same designer bag she had carried to the hospital earlier. I carefully unclasped the gold latch, slipping the second transmitter deep into the lining of the innermost zipper pocket. Wherever she went, whatever she said to my son Lawson and I would hear every single syllable. The final task was the most dangerous. I returned to the home office and approached her sleek silver laptop resting on the desk. The screen was dark, but a small light pulsed near the hinge indicating it was in sleep mode. I pulled out a specialized USB drive Lawson had configured for me. It was designed to completely bypass passwords and silently clone the entire hard drive in a matter of minutes. I took a deep breath, inserted the drive into the side port, and watched as the screen briefly flickered to life. A dark gray progress bar appeared slowly crawling across the screen. The silence in the room was agonizing. Every second felt like an hour. I stood perfectly still watching the digital percentage climb. 10%. 30%. I thought about the files being copied right now. The fake financial records, the emails to offshore accounts, the digital footprints of their betrayal. This small piece of plastic was going to be the weapon that destroyed them. 50%. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making my heart skip a beat. I wiped a drop of cold sweat from my forehead. 70%. I just needed 2 more minutes. Suddenly, the progress bar stalled at 89%. I leaned closer, my hands gripping the edge of the desk, silently willing the machine to move faster. After 10 agonizing seconds, the bar jumped to 100%. The screen went dark again. I quickly pulled the USB drive free and slipped it safely back into my pocket. The evidence was secured. But just as I turned to leave the office, a sound tore through the quiet house. It was a sharp, distinct creak from the floorboards upstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body locking tight. Then the unmistakable sound of a bedroom door opening echoed down the wooden staircase. Someone was coming down. It was Rachel. Panic surged through my veins. I could not make it back to the guest room in time. I was caught in the middle of the hallway. I frantically looked around for cover. To my left, tucked beneath the curve of the grand staircase, was a narrow coat closet. I lunged for the handle, pulled the door open, and slipped inside just as the soft thud of footsteps reached the bottom stair. I carefully pulled the door shut, leaving only a microscopic crack to see through. The closet was pitch black and smelled heavily of winter coats. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Through the tiny crack, I saw Rachel walk into the hallway. She was wearing a silk robe, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. She looked annoyed, running a hand through her hair. She walked right past my hiding spot. She was so close I could hear the soft rustle of her robe and smell the lingering scent of her expensive lotion. My heart hammered against my ribs so loud I was terrified she would hear it. She did not look toward the closet. She simply walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and slowly poured herself a large, chilled glass of white wine. I watched through this narrow sliver of the closet door as Rachel took a long, slow sip of her wine. The glass caught the moonlight, casting a faint glow across her relaxed features. She did not look like a woman mourning a lost husband. She looked like a woman celebrating a victory. She stood in the kitchen for what felt like an eternity, occasionally checking her phone and smiling at the screen. My legs began to cramp from standing perfectly still, but I forced my muscles to hold tight. I breathed in shallow, silent gasps, praying the floorboards would not betray me. Finally, she rinsed the glass in the sink, pulled her silk robe tighter around her shoulders, and walked back toward the stairs. I listened to the soft padding of her footsteps ascending to the second floor, followed by the distant click of her bedroom door shutting. I waited another full 10 minutes just to be absolutely certain. Only then did I gently push the closet door open and slip back through the hallway, making my way into the guest room. I slid under the luxurious covers, my heart still pounding, but a grim satisfaction settling over me. The trap was set. When the morning sun finally broke through the heavy Seattle clouds, I was already awake. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the sounds of the house waking up. I let out a loud rattling cough, making sure it echoed through the walls. A few minutes later, Rachel knocked softly and opened the door. She carried a tray with a bowl of oatmeal and a cup of green tea, wearing a perfectly rehearsed expression of deep concern. "Good morning, Thomas," she cooed gently, setting the tray on the nightstand. "Did you sleep at all?" I gave her a weak, trembling smile. "Not much, my dear," I wheezed, placing a hand over my chest. "I think I need some fresh air. It feels a bit stuffy in here." Rachel nodded sympathetically, helping me put on my robe and guiding me out to the back porch. She settled me into a plush wicker chair overlooking her manicured lawn. "I will be inside working if you need anything," she promised, patting my shoulder before going back inside. The moment the sliding glass door shut behind her, my frail posture vanished. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out a small, flesh-colored earpiece Lawson had provided. I slipped it securely into my right ear, adjusting the volume dial on the tiny receiver hidden in my palm. The device emitted a soft, static hum, followed instantly by the crystal-clear sound of Rachel walking through the house. The microphone I had planted under her desk was functioning perfectly. I could hear the rustle of papers, the click of her computer mouse, and the soft hum of the central heating unit. I sat on the porch, staring out at the frost-covered grass, waiting patiently. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the distinct sound of her dialing a number on her cell phone. It rang twice before a man answered. The voice coming through my earpiece was undeniably Henry. He sounded relaxed, cheerful, and entirely alive. "Good morning, beautiful Henry," said smoothly. "Is our house guest behaving himself?" Rachel let out a sharp, genuine laugh that I had never heard before. It was a cold, calculating sound. "Oh, he is a perfect nightmare," she replied, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "The old man is coughing his lungs out downstairs. I had to bring him oatmeal like a nursemaid. It is repulsive." Henry chuckled softly. "Just bear with it, baby. Just play dead for 4 more days. Once the judge signs the certificate on Friday and the 5 million clears into the account, we are done with him." "What is the plan for the relic anyway?" Rachel sighed, the sound of her typing echoing through the earpiece. "I found a state facility on the edge of town," she stated flatly. "The moment the money drops, we dump him there. It is cheap depressing, and they ask 0 questions. Then we board the flight to Zurich and never look back." Henry laughed out loud through the phone, a deep, cruel sound that vibrated directly into my ear. "Do not worry about him catching on," Henry sneered. "He is too stupid to notice anyway." The line went dead. The silence returned to the earpiece, but those words echoed over and over in my mind. "He is too stupid to notice anyway." I slowly lowered my hands to my lap, turning them over in the bright morning light. I looked at the deep, rough calluses covering my palms. I looked at the thick, jagged scar running across my left thumb, a permanent reminder of a table saw accident I endured 20 years ago. I refused to take a single day off to heal because I desperately needed the money to pay for Henry's expensive private school tuition. These hands had swung heavy hammers until my fingers bled. These hands had hauled damp lumber through the freezing rain, mixed heavy concrete, until my back felt like it would literally snap in half, and built a massive empire from the dirt up. I did all of this to ensure my son would never know a single day of struggle or hardship. I gave him a beautiful life of immense privilege built entirely on the systematic destruction of my own body. And my ultimate reward was being called a stupid relic destined to be dumped in a dirty state facility to die completely alone. The last remaining fragment of a father's unconditional love quietly evaporated from my tired soul. The profound, suffocating pain of his absolute betrayal hardened instantly, crystallizing into something entirely different and unbreakable. The pain turned into absolute steel. I was going to crush them all without mercy. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense, suffocating blur. I stayed out on the back porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, pretending to sleep while my mind meticulously reviewed every single piece of evidence Lawson and I had gathered. When the sun finally dipped below the Seattle skyline, casting long gray shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, Rachel slid the heavy glass door open. She told me dinner was ready. I leaned heavily on the armrests, forcing my legs to tremble as I stood up. I shuffled slowly into the dining room, my posture hunched, playing the absolute role of a man whose body was entirely giving out. The dining table was set perfectly, with expensive porcelain plates and polished silver. My young grandson was sitting in his high chair, babbling happily, completely oblivious to the monstrous deception surrounding his entire existence. Rachel walked out of the kitchen and placed a steaming full bowl of rich tomato soup directly in front of me. This was the moment for psychological warfare. I picked up the heavy silver spoon, ensuring my hand shook violently. I scooped up a large portion of the red liquid, bringing it halfway to my mouth, before intentionally letting my wrist completely give way. The spoon clattered loudly against the edge of the ceramic bowl. The hot red soup splashed heavily across the front of my white undershirt and the pristine beige tablecloth. I let out a pathetic, trembling gasp, immediately dropping my hands to my lap. "Oh, I am so sorry," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. "My hands, they just will not stop shaking. I am so clumsy, Rachel. Please forgive me." For a fraction of a second, the mask of the grieving, devoted daughter-in-law completely shattered. I watched her eyes narrow into sharp slits of pure, unadulterated disgust. Her upper lip curled back, exposing her teeth, and she let out a sharp, exasperated breath that sounded exactly like a snake hissing. She looked at the red stain on her expensive tablecloth, as if it were an infectious disease. She looked at me not as a human being, but as a disgusting burden that was ruining her perfect aesthetic. But then, remembering her role, she forced a tight, entirely fake smile onto her face. The transition was terrifying to witness. "It is fine, Thomas," she said, her voice strained and clipped. "Let me get a towel. Do not try to clean it yourself." I sat there wiping my chin with a linen napkin, apologizing profusely. Inside, I was perfectly calm. Every time she looked at me with that hidden contempt, she was unknowingly digging her own grave a little deeper. We finished the rest of the meal in a suffocating silence. After she cleared the plates and put my grandson to bed, she poured herself a large glass of iced water and sat back down at the table, checking her phone. I knew exactly what she was looking at. She was counting down the hours until Friday morning. I decided to give the knife one final twist. "Rachel," I said softly, my voice weak and raspy, "I know Friday is going to be a terrible day for you. Standing in front of that judge, making it official. It breaks my heart that you have to go through this absolute tragedy alone." She locked her phone and looked at me, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. "It has to be done, Thomas. For closure. So we can finally move on." I nodded slowly, staring down at my ruined, stained shirt. "I understand, my dear. What will you wear for such a difficult occasion?" Rachel stood up from the table, taking her water glass to the sink. She did not even turn around to look at me when she answered. She just smiled sweetly to the empty kitchen window. "Black, Thomas. For mourning." That night, I did not wait for the clock to strike 2 in the morning. I waited just long enough for the house to settle into a deep, heavy sleep. I bypassed the biometric security system with the exact same quiet precision I had used the night before, slipping past the cameras without leaving a single digital trace. I eased the heavy front door open, pulling my dark coat collar up against the biting Seattle chill. I walked down the dark suburban street, keeping to the shadows of the massive oak trees, until I reached the dimly lit parking lot of a closed grocery store 3 blocks away. A large, unassuming black SUV was idling in the darkest corner of the asphalt lot, its headlights turned off. As I approached, the side door slid open with a soft mechanical hum. I stepped inside, the heavy door shutting behind me, instantly sealing out the freezing wind. Richard was sitting in the middle row, his face illuminated by the soft blue glow of Lawson's multiple laptop screens. Lawson sat in the back, surrounded by organized stacks of printed documents and thick legal files. But we were not alone. Sitting in the front seats of the vehicle were two men wearing dark, tailored suits. They possessed the quiet, intense posture of men who carried concealed weapons and federal badges. Thomas Richard said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Meet Agent Miller and Agent Davis from the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I nodded to the agents, taking a seat next to my brother. Lawson turned his primary laptop toward me. "The USB drive you used to clone her computer gave us absolutely everything we needed," Thomas Lawson explained, tapping a silver pen against the screen. "We have the encrypted emails between Rachel and Henry. We have the digital bank receipts for the Zurich flight tickets booked under their fake aliases. We have the offshore routing numbers, and we have the crystal-clear audio recording of Rachel plotting to dump you in a state facility the moment the money clears. It is a complete, undeniable mountain of federal evidence." Agent Miller, the older of the two federal agents, turned around in his seat to face me. His expression was grim. "Mr. Thurman, we have been reviewing the files your investigator provided. If your son had simply faked his death and walked away, this might have been a complicated local jurisdiction issue. But Henry and Rachel made a massive, fatal miscalculation. By communicating across state lines to coordinate this deception, and by attempting to actively defraud a corporate life insurance provider out of $5 million, they have elevated this entire scheme to a major federal crime. They are committing wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud on a massive interstate scale." Agent Davis chimed in, his voice sharp and strictly professional. "The moment Rachel stands before that judge on Friday and files the fraudulent death certificate to officially trigger the insurance payout, the federal trap snaps shut. We have an elite tactical team stationed in Idaho right now, watching the mansion from the woods. They are monitoring Henry's every movement. They know about his private charter flight scheduled to leave for Switzerland. We are coordinating a simultaneous strike. The very second we place Rachel under arrest inside the Seattle courtroom, the tactical SWAT team in Idaho will breach the gates of the mansion and take your son into federal custody. They will not even have a single second to warn each other." I looked at the printed flight itineraries, the bank statements, and the forged loan documents spread across the leather seats of the SUV. The preparation was absolute. The federal government was now fully invested in the destruction of my son's criminal empire. It was no longer just a betrayed father seeking personal justice. It was a massive federal sting operation, and I was the bait that had lured them perfectly into the open. "Are you ready for this, Thomas?" Richard asked softly, placing a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. "It is going to be brutal. Once those courtroom doors open on Friday morning, there is absolutely no turning back. You will be sending your only flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary for a very long time." I looked my brother right in the eye. The memory of the cold soup spilling on my shirt, the look of pure disgust on Rachel's face, and the sound of my son laughing at my misery echoed loudly in my mind. "I am ready," I said, my voice as cold and hard as solid concrete. "Set the trap." The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy gray downpour that felt entirely appropriate for a funeral, or in this case, the legal fabrication of one. I rode to the downtown Seattle courthouse not in the back of my brother's luxurious Rolls-Royce, but in a standard, unassuming taxi. I needed to maintain the illusion of the broken, impoverished father right up until the very last second. When I stepped out into the freezing rain, leaning heavily on a wooden cane I had purchased from a local pharmacy, the sheer scale of the stone building looming above me felt suffocating. The King County Superior Court was a massive, imposing structure of marble and glass, a place where lives were forever altered with the simple strike of a wooden gavel. I slowly made my way up the wide concrete steps, forcing my hands to tremble, playing the role of the frail old man who was about to officially lose his only son to the permanent records of the state. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 4B, just as the clerk was calling the docket to order. The room was sparsely populated, mostly filled with bored legal assistants and families waiting for their own tragedies to be processed. I shuffled down the center aisle, my cane clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor, and took a seat in the very last row. I slumped forward, resting my chin on my hands, my posture projecting absolute defeat. Up at the petitioner's table sat Rachel. She was a vision of perfectly calculated mourning. She wore a tailored, elegant black dress that managed to look both conservative and incredibly expensive. A delicate black silk scarf was draped over her shoulders, and her dark hair was pulled back into a neat, respectful clasp. She sat next to her highly paid attorney, her head bowed slightly, dabbing the corners of her dry eyes with a pristine white tissue. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and the room rose to its feet. I pushed myself up with agonizing slowness, letting out a soft, strained groan for the benefit of anyone listening. Judge Harold Bennett took his seat at the elevated mahogany bench. He was an older man with stern eyes and a thick gray mustache, a man who had likely presided over hundreds of these tragic missing persons cases. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the thick file resting in front of him. "We are here today to review the petition for the declaration of presumptive death concerning Henry Thurman." The judge announced, his deep voice echoing through the quiet, solemn courtroom. "The petitioner is the spouse of the missing individual, Mrs. Rachel Higgins. Counsel, you may proceed with your opening statement." Rachel's attorney stood up, offering a brief, somber summary of the legal timeline. He established that exactly 5 years had passed since the abandoned boat was discovered, that massive search efforts had yielded absolutely no results, and that the statutory requirements for a death certificate had been met. But the lawyer was merely the warm-up act. The true performance began when the judge gently asked Rachel if she wished to address the court before he made his final ruling. Rachel stood up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table as if she needed it to keep from collapsing under the weight of her immense grief. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice trembling with the precise amount of vulnerability required to break a sympathetic heart. "Friday, exactly 5 years ago, my entire world simply vanished. My husband went out on that lake, and he never came home to me or our young son. For 5 agonizing years, I have woken up every single morning holding on to a tiny, desperate shred of hope. I have jumped at every phone call. I have stared out the front window, praying to see his car pull into the driveway." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, pressing the white tissue to her nose. The judge leaned forward, his expression softening with genuine pity. I watched her from the back row, feeling a cold knot of absolute disgust tighten in my chest. She was magnificent. If I had not heard her laughing on that hidden microphone, calling me a stupid relic, I might have actually believed the tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. But the hope is gone now. "Your Honor," Rachel continued, her voice cracking perfectly on the last word. "I have to be strong for my little boy. I have to explain to him why his father is never coming back. I am raising him entirely alone, working as hard as I possibly can just to keep a roof over our heads. We cannot remain frozen in this terrible limbo forever. We need to close this dark chapter. We need this legal declaration not just for the paperwork, but for our own emotional survival. I am simply asking the court to grant us peace. We desperately need closure." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a brief second. Rachel slowly sat back down, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, fabricated sobs. The judge removed his glasses, letting out a heavy, empathetic sigh. It was the performance of a lifetime. She had completely manipulated the highest legal authority in the room, just as she and Henry had manipulated me for half a decade. As her lawyer whispered comforting words to her, Rachel subtly shifted in her chair. She turned her head slightly, looking over her shoulder toward the back of the courtroom. Her eyes found me sitting there in the shadows, slumped over my wooden cane, looking like a shattered, pathetic old fool. For one brief, fleeting second, the mask of the grieving widow slipped. Through the fake tears and the sorrowful posture, she flashed me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. That fleeting look of triumph on Rachel's face lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was all I needed. It was the absolute confirmation of the deep malice that had driven her every action for the past 5 years. She quickly lowered her head, burying her face in her hands, to hide any trace of that wicked smile from the judge. The courtroom remained draped in a suffocating silence. The only sound was the continuous patter of the cold Seattle rain beating against the high, arched windows, providing a perfectly fitting soundtrack for the somber theater she had flawlessly orchestrated. Judge Bennett let out a long breath, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked down at the thick legal file resting on his mahogany desk, his expression burdened by the weight of the human tragedy he believed he was witnessing. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked back up at Rachel with a gaze full of genuine paternal sympathy. "Mrs. Higgins," the judge said softly, his deep voice echoing in the quiet room. "The court deeply sympathizes with your profound loss today. Losing a spouse in such a sudden, unresolved manner is a heavy burden no family should ever have to bear. You have demonstrated remarkable strength in raising your young son alone under these heartbreaking circumstances." The judge reached out with his right hand and picked up a heavy gold fountain pen from his desk. He unscrewed the cap with slow, deliberate movements. Rachel remained seated beside her attorney, her head still bowed in a display of perfect, fragile sorrow. But from my vantage point in the back row, I could clearly see the sudden tension in her narrow shoulders. She was holding her breath, waiting with agonizing anticipation for the final stroke of black ink that would officially secure her stolen millions. "The court has meticulously reviewed all the submitted documentation and sworn affidavits." The judge continued, his tone shifting smoothly back to a place of formal legal authority. "The mandatory 5-year waiting period required by state law has been satisfied in full. The extensive search efforts by local Marine units and state police have been thoroughly documented and are considered completely exhausted. Therefore, based entirely on the compelling evidence presented before me today, I find no legal reason to delay this painful matter any further." He leaned forward and positioned the gold pen directly over the final signature line on the crisp white paper. "It is the formal ruling of this court that the petition is hereby granted. I am prepared to sign the declaration of presumptive death for Henry Thurman, officially closing this case and allowing his estate to be settled." The sharp metal tip of his pen hovered just a millimeter above the paper. This was the exact moment she had waited 5 excruciating years for. This was the precise second the trap needed to snap completely shut. I did not hesitate for a single heartbeat. I uncurled my trembling fingers from the curved handle of the wooden cane. I simply let it go. The heavy stick hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the silent courtroom exactly like a gunshot. The sudden noise startled absolutely everyone. The court reporter jumped visibly in her seat. The judge stopped his pen in midair, his head snapping up in sheer surprise. Rachel twisted around in her padded chair, her eyes widening in genuine alarm as she looked back at me. I did not look like a broken, defeated, dying old man anymore. I stood up. I did not struggle. I did not shake. I pushed myself to my full height, straightening my spine. I pulled my shoulders back, taking a deep, steadying breath of the cool air. I looked directly at the man sitting behind the high mahogany bench, my gaze locking with his. "Objection. Your Honor," I said. My voice was not a raspy, weak wheeze. It was a deep, resonant boom that carried the undeniable authority of a father who had survived absolute hell. The sheer volume of my voice seemed to physically shake the stagnant air in the room. The judge stared at me in complete bewilderment. "Excuse me, sir," he stammered, taken aback by the forceful interruption. "Who are you, and what is the meaning of this outburst in my courtroom?" Rachel scrambled to her feet in a panic, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor," she cried out, her voice pitching instantly into a frantic whine. "This is my father-in-law, Thomas Thurman. He is severely ill. He is suffering from advanced heart failure and terminal dementia. He does not know what he is doing or where he is. Please excuse his behavior. His mind is gone." I kept my eyes locked solely on the judge, ignoring her pathetic lies. "I am of perfectly sound mind." "Your Honor," I replied, my tone calm and utterly unwavering, "and I object to the signing of that death certificate, because the man you are about to declare legally dead is currently breathing, walking, and committing massive federal fraud." Before the judge could process my words, a massive sound erupted from the back of the room. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom did not just open. They were pushed wide open with overwhelming force. They slammed violently against the interior walls with a deafening crash. The atmosphere froze. Every head turned toward the entrance. Marching down the center aisle, moving with the synchronized purpose of absolute justice, was my brother Richard. Beside him walked Lawson, clutching a thick briefcase filled with our undeniable evidence. Flanking them firmly on both sides, their federal gold badges gleaming against their dark suits, were Agent Miller, Agent Davis, and a third armed FBI agent. The sheer gravity of their arrival sucked the air straight out of the room. They walked with a heavy cadence that sounded exactly like a death march for Rachel's constructed empire. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the three federal agents marched down the aisle, their leather shoes striking the polished floor in perfect unison. Judge Bennett lowered his gold pen, his eyes darting between the armed men and my brother Richard, who was looking at Rachel with the cold, detached expression of an executioner. Rachel had completely frozen in her chair. The tissue she had been using to dab her fake tears slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the floor. Her highly paid attorney stood up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, desperately trying to comprehend the sudden invasion of federal authority in a simple family court proceeding. I did not wait for the bailiff or the judge to restore order. I turned my back on the federal agents and walked straight toward the elevated mahogany bench. I did not shuffle. I did not hunch my shoulders. I walked with the heavy, grounded stride of a man who had spent 40 years building foundations out of steel and concrete. I stopped right in front of the judge, looking him directly in the eye. "I object to the death certificate." "Your Honor," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out in the absolute silence. "Because last Tuesday, I had barbecue with this corpse in Idaho." The judge blinked, his stern face contorting into a mask of pure shock. He looked from me to Rachel and then to the federal agents who had now taken positions around the perimeter of the room. "Mr. Thurman," the judge warned, his voice shaking slightly, "these are incredibly serious allegations. You cannot interrupt a legal proceeding with absurd claims unless you have absolute proof." I did not say another word. I simply stepped aside as Lawson walked up to the bench, unlatching his thick leather briefcase. He pulled out a stack of crisp, glossy 8x10 photographs and slammed them down directly on top of Rachel's fraudulent legal petition. The sharp slap of the paper hitting the wood echoed like thunder. The top photograph showed Henry standing by his infinity pool, wearing expensive linen shorts and flipping a thick ribeye steak on a stainless steel grill. The patio lights perfectly illuminated his face, and clearly visible on his left wrist was the solid gold Patek Philippe watch. The judge physically recoiled, staring at the high-resolution image of the man he was just seconds away from declaring legally dead. Lawson did not stop there. He slapped down a second stack of papers, spreading them out so the judge could see every single line. "These are certified bank records from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands," Lawson explained, his voice projecting clearly across the room. "They show the exact path of the $8 million Henry Thurman stole from his father's company by forging signature loans just 3 days before his staged disappearance. These documents also prove a direct, unbroken chain of weekly wire transfers amounting to $25,000 sent directly to the personal bank account of the grieving widow sitting right behind me." The judge quickly flipped through the pages, his face turning an angry shade of red as the sheer magnitude of the fraud became undeniably clear. Rachel let out a choked, desperate gasp, She gripped the edge of her table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Her attorney immediately stepped away from her, realizing in real time that his client had just made him an unwitting accessory to a massive federal crime. But I wanted to ensure the destruction of her facade was absolute. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, which was wirelessly connected to Lawson's encrypted audio files. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmur in the room. "This woman just stood before you and cried about her broken heart. She claimed she was a struggling single mother who needed peace. I would like the court to hear exactly what kind of peace she was waiting for." I pressed a single button on my screen. Lawson had already connected the audio feed to a small portable Bluetooth speaker he placed on the bench. The sound quality was terrifyingly crisp. Rachel's voice filled the quiet courtroom, cold and dripping with absolute malice. "The old man is coughing his lungs out. Just play dead for 4 days. Once the judge signs the certificate and the 5 million clears, we dump him in a state facility and fly to Zurich." Then came the sound of Henry laughing. He is too stupid to notice anyway. The recording stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The judge looked at Rachel with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The sympathy that had warmed his eyes just minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by the righteous fury of a man who had been deeply and personally manipulated. Rachel was visibly trembling. Her meticulously applied makeup could not hide the fact that her face had drained of all color, turning a sickly, pale white. The elegant black dress she wore for mourning suddenly looked exactly like a prison uniform. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes darting from the judge to her horrified lawyer to the federal agents standing by the heavy wooden doors. A primal, animalistic panic took over her entire body. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream, knocking her chair backward as she scrambled to her feet. She grabbed her designer handbag and bolted toward the center aisle, desperately trying to run for the exit. But she barely made it 3 steps. Agent Miller and Agent Davis moved with lightning speed, stepping directly into her path, like a solid brick wall blocking her completely from any hope of escape. She hit their broad shoulders, sobbing uncontrollably, as the cold metal handcuffs finally came out, clicking sharply over her shaking wrists and ending her perfect lie forever in total, devastating humiliation. The click of the steel handcuffs locking around Rachel's wrists echoed with a heavy finality that altered the atmosphere of the courtroom. She thrashed against the grip of the 2 federal agents, the illusion of the grieving widow completely shattered. Her attorney backed away frantically, stuffing his legal pads into his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the toxic fallout. The judge watched the scene unfold with a stern expression, the sympathy in his eyes entirely replaced by the cold reality of the law. Rachel was weeping now, but these were not the calculated tears she had rehearsed. They were the ugly sobs of a woman who had just watched her stolen future disintegrate into thin air. As the agents read Rachel her Miranda rights, my brother Richard stepped calmly toward the center aisle. He raised a sleek silver tablet, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the courtroom. It displayed a live video feed transmitted directly from Lawson's tactical team over 400 miles away. "Look closely," Thomas Richard said, his deep voice cutting effortlessly through the chaos. "Justice is rarely this punctual, but today they coordinated their schedules perfectly." I stepped closer to my brother, looking down at the digital display. The live feed was captured by a surveillance drone hovering high above the $10 million lakefront estate in Idaho. The camera zoomed in, adjusting to focus on the sprawling marble patio overlooking the rippling waters of the lake. There, lounging unaware on a white-cushioned deck chair beside the heated infinity pool, was Henry. He wore designer swim trunks, holding a crystal glass of champagne. His left arm was draped casually over the chair, the expensive watch catching the midday sun. He looked blissfully ignorant that his empire was burning to the ground. But the tranquility of his stolen paradise lasted only seconds longer. The drone camera panned left, capturing the security gates at the front of the massive driveway. They were violently ripped off their hinges by the steel bumper of a black armored federal tactical vehicle. The truck surged up the stone driveway, tearing through the manicured landscaping, followed by 3 unmarked SUVs. Flashing red and blue strobe lights cut a chaotic pattern against the towering glass windows of the mansion. On the screen, Henry sat up abruptly, his champagne glass slipping from his fingers and shattering across the marble patio. He ripped his sunglasses off his face, staring in terror as heavily armed federal SWAT agents poured out of the vehicles. They wore dark tactical gear helmets and ballistic vests. I watched through the drone feed as the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion were violently kicked open, splintering the expensive wood. A dozen agents swarmed into the luxurious house, moving with terrifying synchronized speed. Henry scrambled to his feet, slipping frantically on the spilled champagne. The instinct of a guilty man took over, and he turned to run toward the edge of the infinity pool, thinking he could dive into the lake and vanish. But he did not even make it 3 steps. The tactical team burst through the rear glass doors, swarming the patio like a wave of dark water. 2 heavily armored agents lunged forward, tackling Henry with incredible, brutal force. The impact sent him flying over the edge of the marble deck, crashing heavily into the shallow water of the infinity pool. The drone camera zoomed in, capturing the chaotic struggle in the water. Henry was thrashing wildly, screaming in panic, but he was completely outmatched. The agents grabbed his arms, dragging his soaking wet body out of the warm water and forcefully across the rough concrete edge of the patio. They slammed him face down onto the hard marble floor. One agent planted a tactical boot squarely between Henry's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. In stark, synchronized parallel to the courtroom I was standing in, the agents forcefully yanked Henry's arms behind his back. The sunlight caught the glint of the steel handcuffs just a second before they were ratcheted tightly around his wrists, locking right next to the expensive watch he had bought with my ruined life. The live feed froze on the image of my son pinned to the ground, his face pressed flat against the wet stone. Richard slowly lowered the tablet, turning his gaze back to the chaotic scene unfolding right in front of us. The federal agents in the courtroom had finally managed to subdue Rachel, pulling her to her feet. Her hands were secured tightly behind her back, her black silk scarf falling to the dirty floor. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her chest heaving with desperate, jagged breaths. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting past the stern judge, past the silent federal agents, until they finally locked onto me. She saw the absolute calm in my posture. She saw my brother standing beside me, the glowing tablet resting in his hands. And in that moment, she realized I had orchestrated every single piece of this devastating destruction. She realized I was the Trojan horse that had burned her perfect life to ash. "Thomas," she choked out, her voice a pathetic, broken whisper that echoed in the vast courtroom. "Please, please do not let them do this. You have to tell them to stop. He is your boy. Please, Thomas, you are his father." The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. The judge, the agents, and my brother all watched me, waiting for the final word from the man who had lost everything. I looked down at the woman who had laughed at my misery, the woman who had planned to throw me into a state facility to die alone. I felt absolutely no pity. I looked her directly in her wide-open, desperate eyes, my voice as cold and hard as the concrete patio where my former son was currently bleeding. "No, I just do not have a son." 3 days after those words left my mouth, the dust had begun to settle on the wreckage of my former life. The authorities had moved with efficiency. Rachel was denied bail and transferred to a holding facility in Seattle. The mansion in Idaho was seized by the government, along with every offshore account Lawson had identified. The luxury cars, designer clothes, and gold watch were confiscated as evidence of a massive conspiracy. Henry, the architect of my ruin, was transported to a maximum security detention center. I had not spoken a word to him since he hugged me on that patio, pretending to be a terrified man running from a cartel. But there was one piece of business I needed to conclude. I needed to look him in the eye one last time, not as a grieving father, but as the man who orchestrated his downfall. The drive to the lockup was quiet. Richard offered to come, but I politely declined. This was a burial I had to attend alone. The detention center was a concrete structure surrounded by high wire fences and armed guards. I walked through the steel doors, surrendering my phone belt and coat to the security personnel. I was escorted down a sterile corridor painted a sickening shade of pale green. The air smelled of bleach and stale sweat. A guard opened a metal door, gesturing for me to enter a small, windowless interrogation room. A single metal table was bolted to the floor, flanked by two uncomfortable steel chairs. I sat down and folded my hands perfectly still on the cold metal surface, waiting for the ghost of my past to arrive. 10 minutes later, the door on the opposite side of the room clicked open. Two guards stepped inside, flanking the man who used to be my entire world. The transformation in Henry was staggering. Just a week ago, he was a bronzed millionaire sipping champagne by an infinity pool. Now he was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His dark hair was unwashed and messy. His wrists and ankles were bound in metal chains that rattled loudly with every step he took. The tan had washed off his face, leaving him looking pale, sickly, and incredibly small. The guards forced him into the steel chair across from me and stepped back, securing the heavy door behind them. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Henry stared down at his chained hands, his chest heaving. Then the tears began to fall. They were not the calculated theatrical tears Rachel had used in the courtroom. This was the raw weeping of a man who realized his life was over. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and immediately tried to play the only card he thought he had left. He sobbed, his voice cracking violently. "Dad, please. You have to help me. I am your boy. I am your only son. You cannot let them do this to me. I am terrified in here. Please talk to Richard. Use his lawyers. We can fix this. I know I made a mistake, but I am still your boy." I sat there watching him cry, feeling absolutely nothing. The well of unconditional love that had sustained me for 38 years was dry. I did not raise my voice. I did not pound my fists on the metal table. I simply looked at him with the detached curiosity of a stranger. "I am not going to help you, Henry." I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that made him freeze. "In fact, I am the reason you are sitting in that orange jumpsuit." I watched the confusion wash over his pale face as he struggled to comprehend my words. I leaned forward slightly, my voice remaining perfectly calm. "You thought I was just a clueless old man," I continued, watching his eyes widen. "You thought I would simply swallow your ridiculous story about a cartel. But the truth is, the moment I saw that $50,000 watch on your wrist, I knew exactly what you were. So I went to Seattle. I faked a heart attack right on the sidewalk to force Rachel to let me into her house. I bypassed the security system that I personally wired. I planted an audio bug under her desk, and I cloned her laptop while she was upstairs drinking wine." Henry let out a choked gasp, his jaw dropping as the absolute reality of my infiltration finally hit him. I heard everything I said softly. I heard her complaining about the soup I spilled on my shirt. I heard her say she would dump me in a cheap state facility the moment the money cleared. And I heard you laughing. I heard you tell her that I was too stupid to notice. That was your fatal mistake. You underestimated the man who built your life from the dirt up. I took all your encrypted files, offshore accounts, and Zurich flight tickets straight to the authorities. I engineered the courtroom raid. I coordinated the SWAT team that dragged you out of your pool. I dismantled your entire existence while you were laughing at me." He stared at me in horrified silence. The realization that he had been outplayed seemed to physically crush him. He slumped forward, burying his face in his chained hands, sobbing hysterically. I stood up from the cold metal chair. I looked down at the broken shell of a man weeping across the table. "I formally disown you," I stated, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You are dead to me now, and this time it is permanent. Do not ever contact me again." I turned my back on his desperate pleas. I walked out the heavy steel door without looking back, leaving him completely alone in the cold room to face the ruin he had built for himself. Stepping out of the maximum security detention center, the cold afternoon air hit my face, and for the first time in 5 years, it felt incredibly clean. I walked to the waiting car, leaving my former son behind those thick concrete walls. The legal gears of the federal justice system had already begun to turn, and once they started, they ground Henry and Rachel down to absolute dust. The trial itself was a spectacle of pure cowardice. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of evidence, Lawson and the federal agents had meticulously gathered, their united front completely collapsed within a matter of mere days after the initial arrests were made. The devoted husband and the grieving widow turned on each other like starved animals. Rachel's highly paid defense attorney desperately tried to paint her as a manipulated victim, claiming she was forced into the entire scheme under severe emotional duress. Henry violently retaliated by providing the federal prosecutors with hidden text messages, proving Rachel was actually the one who orchestrated the insurance fraud timeline. It was a pathetic, ugly display of two deeply selfish people trying to save their own skin. But the federal judge was entirely unmoved by their pointing fingers and their endless, desperate legal maneuvers presented in court. On the day of their final sentencing, the federal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. I sat quietly in the front row, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, no longer needing to play the pathetic role of the broken, shivering old man. I watched with quiet, absolute satisfaction as the stern judge handed down their ultimate fate. For the massive charges of federal conspiracy, interstate wire fraud, and attempted corporate insurance fraud, both Henry and Rachel were sentenced to exactly 15 years in a federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole. There would be no comfortable house arrest. They were going to spend the next decade and a half locked inside small concrete cages, entirely stripped of the luxury they had stolen my life to buy. The financial dismantling of their fraudulent empire was just as thorough and brutal. The federal government swiftly seized the $10 million lakefront mansion in Idaho, placing it immediately on the public auction block. The hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely frozen, systematically dismantled, and the funds were repatriated back to the United States. The luxury sports cars, the pristine designer wardrobes, and that heavy gold watch. They were all confiscated as the direct proceeds of major federal crimes. Everything they had built on my absolute suffering was completely erased from the face of the earth. But the court did not just punish the guilty. The court aggressively restored what was rightfully mine. Through the federal asset forfeiture program and mandatory legal restitution orders, I was completely cleared of the fraudulent corporate debt that had destroyed my original contracting business. The massive $8 million that Henry had secretly siphoned away was tracked down and returned directly to my completely restored personal banking accounts without delay. In addition to the stolen principal amount, the court awarded me substantial punitive damages, liquidating the remaining seized assets to compensate for the 5 years of emotional agony and utter financial ruin I had unfairly endured. When my personal banker called to confirm the final massive wire transfer from the federal treasury, I simply stared at the 8-figure balance glowing brightly on my computer screen. The money was finally back, but it meant something entirely different to me now. It was no longer just operational capital to run a construction business or buy heavy industrial machinery. It was a physical monument to my ultimate survival. It was undeniable proof that I had fought the absolute darkest betrayal imaginable and emerged completely victorious. I had officially taken back the crown of my own life. But the returned money, the seized luxury mansions, and the lengthy prison sentences were completely secondary to the most profound and beautiful victory of all. The absolute most important ruling came from the State Family Court Division just a few short weeks later. With both of his toxic parents facing 15 long years inside a federal prison, my young grandson was initially made a temporary ward of the state. Rachel tried desperately from her cold jail cell to have the innocent boy placed with her distant relatives, frantically hoping to maintain some twisted manipulative control over his young life from behind metal bars. I fought her with every single legal resource Richard and I possessed. I stood confidently before a family court judge and presented my case not just as a newly wealthy man, but as a deeply devoted grandfather who absolutely refused to let an innocent child be poisoned by the dark legacy of two cold sociopaths. The judge reviewed the extensive federal files and ruled in my favor without a single moment of hesitation or doubt. I was officially awarded full permanent and sole legal custody of my 7-year-old grandson. The moment the judge signed that final custody order, the last heavy weight anchoring my soul to the painful past was completely lifted. The day I walked out of the state foster care facility, holding his small, warm hand, knowing he was finally safe from the toxic greed that had deeply infected his parents, was the absolute greatest day of my entire life. I looked down at his bright, smiling face as we walked toward the car, and I silently promised him that I would spend every remaining breath in my body teaching him the true meaning of honor, hard work, and loyalty. He would never have to experience the dark shadow of deception that had nearly destroyed our entire family. We drove away from that facility together, leaving the bitterness and the ashes of the past completely behind us. The long, agonizing storm had finally passed, and the beautiful, quiet peace I had fought so hard to safely secure was finally and forever, truly, completely mine. It was a bitterly cold afternoon in late November when I finally visited the cemetery. The air was sharp, biting at my cheeks, carrying a crisp scent that made me feel alive again. I drove my new truck through the iron gates, navigating the winding gravel roads, until I reached the hilltop overlooking the valley. This was where our parents were buried. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my heavy boots. Parked just a few yards away was Richard's sleek black Rolls-Royce. My brother was standing by the twin marble headstones wrapped in a thick wool overcoat. He had his hands shoved into his pockets, staring down at the engraved names of the people who brought us into this world. I walked slowly up the incline, carrying a crystal bottle of aged Macallan single malt scotch and 2 heavy glass tumblers. It was a ridiculously expensive vintage, but today it felt entirely appropriate. When I reached his side, Richard did not turn immediately. We just stood there in the freezing wind, sharing a comfortable silence we had not experienced since we were young boys. I set the 2 glasses down on the flat stone base of our father's grave. I pulled the cork with a soft pop and poured a generous measure of the rich amber liquid into each glass. I handed one to Richard. He took it with a solemn nod. We raised our glasses to the cold, gray sky, a silent toast to the people resting beneath the earth, and to the painfully long journey that finally brought their only 2 sons back together. The scotch burned smoothly on the way down, spreading a comforting warmth through my chest that pushed away the biting autumn chill. Richard took a slow sip, rolling the expensive liquor around in his mouth, before letting out a thoughtful sigh. "We wasted 20 years, Thomas," he said softly, his deep voice carrying easily over the wind. 20 years of stubborn pride and stupid arguments. We let a disagreement about money keep us apart while our lives slipped away. I thought I was so smart, building my real estate empire, looking down on you. But I was a complete fool. When I watched you dismantle the people who tried to bury you, I realized something. He turned to fully face me, his sharp eyes softening with a genuine affection I had not seen in decades. He reached out and placed a heavy, firm hand on my shoulder. "You are the toughest son of a gun I know, Tommy," he said, using the childhood nickname he had not spoken since we were teenagers. "You did not just survive an absolute nightmare. You walked right through the fire and burned the monsters to the ground. I have never been more proud to call you my brother." Hearing those words from Richard broke something loose inside my chest. The residual armor I built up to protect myself finally cracked, allowing a wave of pure healing relief to wash over my soul. I looked at the hand resting on my shoulder, feeling the solid weight of true family. I smiled, a genuine smile that felt completely foreign to my face. I was just as foolish, Richard. I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I let my resentment toward your success completely blind me. I convinced myself my wife and son were the only family I needed. But the universe has a cruel way of teaching us our greatest lessons. We stood there drinking the aged scotch, watching the wind rustle the dry leaves. The bitter irony of our situation was not lost on either of us. It took the complete moral failure of my own flesh and blood to shatter the wall of silence between us. Henry had been born of my blood, raised in my home, and given every piece of my heart. Yet he treated me with the ruthless cruelty of an enemy. Richard and I had not spoken in 2 decades yet. The moment I called him for help, he dropped his entire life, mobilized his massive fortune, and stood by my side like an unbreakable shield. It was the most profound realization of my entire life. Blood and genetics do not make a family. It is simply the starting point. What truly builds a family is absolute respect, unwavering loyalty, and the willingness to stand together when the world is trying to tear you apart. My son had shared my blood, but he possessed absolutely no loyalty. My brother and I had spent half our lives as strangers, but when the darkness came, his loyalty was absolute and terrifyingly powerful. I poured us each another measure of the Macallan, the amber liquid glowing beautifully in the fading afternoon light. We did not need to apologize anymore. We did not need to hash out the bitter details of the argument that separated us 20 years ago. All of that petty resentment had been washed away by the storm we just weathered together. We tapped our glasses together, the sharp ring of the crystal echoing quietly across the peaceful cemetery. We finished our drinks, the warmth settling deeply into our bones. Richard pulled his coat tighter against the wind and gave my shoulder one final squeeze. "I will see you on Sunday for dinner, Tommy," he said, a warm smile breaking across his weathered face. "Bring the boy. I have a new chess set I want to teach him how to play." I nodded, watching him walk back down the hill toward his waiting car. I stood alone by the graves for a few minutes, looking at the names carved into the cold stone. I felt a profound sense of closure. The long feud was officially over. I had lost a son, but I gained a brother, a grandson, and a brand new life. I picked up the empty glasses, turning my face to the wind, ready to finally go home. 6 months have passed since that freezing afternoon at the cemetery, and my life looks completely different today. The dark, leaky cabin in Montana is nothing but a distant memory, a shadow of a life that no longer belongs to me. I bought a beautiful, sprawling ranch-style home on the outskirts of Seattle, surrounded by acres of tall, green pines and open land. As I sit here on the wide cedar porch, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, the morning sun warms my face. The air is filled with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and fresh-cut grass. But the most beautiful sound in the world is not the wind in the trees. It is the bright, ringing laughter of my 7-year-old grandson, echoing across the wide green lawn. He is running alongside a golden retriever puppy we adopted last month, tossing a worn-out tennis ball and tumbling into the soft grass without a single care in the world. He looks healthy. He looks incredibly happy. The heavy, anxious shadow that used to darken his young eyes when he lived with his parents has completely vanished. He is safe now, and I will spend every remaining breath in my lungs ensuring he stays that way forever. I did not just rebuild my personal life. I resurrected my professional life from the ashes they left behind. With the stolen $8 million fully returned to my accounts, I decided I was not quite ready for retirement. I reopened my construction firm. I did not want to build a massive, faceless corporate empire this time around. I scaled it down to something meaningful. I hired back a few of my oldest, most trusted foreman men who had stood by me before the bankruptcy tore us apart. We take on select custom home projects, building them with the absolute highest standard of craftsmanship. And every Saturday morning, I bring my grandson to the active job sites. I bought him a tiny yellow hard hat and a leather tool belt that hangs loosely around his small waist. I am teaching him how to measure twice and cut once. I am showing him how to drive a nail straight and true. But more importantly, I am teaching him that a house is only as strong as the foundation it sits upon. I tell him that if the foundation is cracked, rotten, or built on lies, the entire structure will eventually collapse no matter how pretty the paint looks on the outside. I am making absolutely certain that the foundation of his character is built on honesty, integrity, and hard work, so he never turns into the man his father chose to become. People often ask me how I survived it all. They ask how a father can stand in a federal courtroom and watch his only son be hauled away in chains without completely losing his mind. The truth is not easy to hear, and it is even harder to live. For 38 years, I believed that family was an unbreakable bond, a sacred covenant that could never be severed. I believed that because he shared my blood, he was inherently entitled to my endless forgiveness and my unconditional love. But life taught me a brutal, agonizing lesson. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the most dangerous threats to your survival. Toxic people are exactly like a cancer. It does not matter if that cancer is a stranger or your own flesh and blood. If a cancer is aggressively destroying your body, draining your life, and threatening your very existence, you do not politely ask it to stop. You do not try to reason with it or hope it changes. You surgically cut it out. You remove it completely from your system, no matter how much the procedure hurts, because it is the absolute only way you can survive. I had to cut my son out of my life to save my own soul. It was the most painful decision I have ever made, but it was also the most necessary. I learned that my dignity and my self-respect are worth infinitely more than preserving a fake relationship built entirely on manipulation and greed. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my nightmare, it is this crucial message. Do not ever let anyone use your love as a weapon against you. Do not let family members hold you hostage with guilt. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your assets, and your heart. You owe absolutely nothing to someone who smiles to your face while secretly digging your grave. You are worthy of genuine respect, and you must demand it. Today, I am a man at peace. I have a brother who proved his loyalty when it mattered most. I have a grandson who looks at me with genuine love, not calculating greed. I have my home, my business, and above all else, I have my dignity securely intact. The nightmare is finally over, and the rest of my days will be spent entirely in the beautiful, warming light. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story gave you the courage to stand up to those using you, leave a super thanks and subscribe for more. Please let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to make the difficult choice to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your own peace. I read every single comment, and I find so much strength in knowing that we are navigating these difficult waters together. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear it today, and I will see you in the next life story. Stay strong and never let anyone steal your foundation. It is the most valuable thing you will ever own in this beautiful, unpredictable life of ours. Until next time. Until next.